The writer Margaret Silf tells a story about two friends who had a very close friend of theirs die. She died suddenly, unexpectedly, and way too soon. And her death left them in deep grief for many months. So as a way of remembering their friend, but also a way of dealing with their own grief, they went to the cemetery in the autumn of the year their friend died, and they planted daffodil bulbs on her grave. As with most rituals of grief, they were planting their sorrow, their loss, in a belief that they would rise. Those seeds would rise again into daffodils. They were planting their sorrow, believing in the Paschal mystery, that like those seeds, their friend would rise again. So the following spring, they returned to the grave of their friend, and they were expecting their friend's grave to be a blanket of bright blossoms. But when they arrived, Silf writes, they found no daffodils dancing in the April breeze. Instead, they found a clump of sturdy onion plants. And realizing their mistake, and remembering how their friend loved onions, they howled with laughter, thinking how much their friend would have enjoyed this delicious irony. In tonight's first reading, we heard how the whole Israelite community grumbled because they felt that God has led them astray. That with their stomachs growling, they lash out in anger at Moses and Aaron, saying even though they were slaves in Egypt, at least they had enough to eat. So God decides to meet them in their anger and in their loss by raining down bread from heaven. I've heard the grumbling of the Israelites, God tells Moses, and tell them, you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. I imagine the reaction of the people to those fine flakes they saw covering the desert floor in the morning to be similar to those two friends who saw that they'd planted onions instead of daffodils on their friend's grave. The Israelite says, "What's this?" to those fine flakes. They were surprised and confused. But essentially, the Israelites received the same message that those friends received when they saw their friend's grave. God is with us. God is with us in our sorrow. God meets us in our loss. God fills us. God meets us in our grief and guides us to a new day. That's what those friends did when they started laughing at their mistake. They thought of that great line from the prophet Jeremiah, I will turn their mourning into joy. I will console and gladden them after their sorrows. They could almost hear their friends' laughter, enjoying this moment. And Margaret Silf writes, the darkness of grief holds treasures beyond our imagination, that the poverty of wintering earth contains secret riches. But they reveal themselves in God's time, in God's way. To be a believer is to trust in that unseen, that which is hidden, that is becoming. This, my friends, is the work of faith. In tonight's gospel, as the people kept coming after Jesus, looking for a sign to see if he was their Savior, he says to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in the one he sent. Isn't this also the work of grief? To believe that Jesus is with us in the midst of our loss. Don't be mistaken, grief is hard work. The work of grief is often lonely and solitary and confining, as if we are locked into a prison of deep darkness and dread. To mourn the loss of someone we love is not the same as grief. Roger Rosenblatt points out in his book, Kayak Mourning, when people asked him the difference between mourning and grief, he says, mourning has company. And it's true, isn't it? After all the rituals of leave-taking are over, The funeral liturgy and luncheon are finished. The loved one is buried. The food that was brought over by neighbors has been put away. The cards and notes of sympathy have slowed to a crawl. That's when the hard work of grief begins. Each of us has known this darkness of grief. And with all due respect to Charlie Brown, who used to say when he saw the antics of Snoopy, "Good grief," I'm not sure there is such a thing. Grief is a difficult and exhausting work. When my youngest sister, Mary, died unexpectedly at the age of 47, on November 29, 2010, I threw myself into all sorts of distractions, keeping busy with various activities and commitments. A few months after Mary died, I was elected provincial director of my community, which carries a grief all its own. And then I was reelected this just a few months ago. But through all of this, my grief over my sister kept gnawing at the underbelly of my consciousness. The grief over my sister's death is more persistent than when I remember when my older brother Ed died in 1987. Ed's death was not expected either. It was more sudden than Mary's. Since it was a suicide, we never had a chance to say goodbye. But Ed suffered for several years from mental illness. His paranoid schizophrenia had finally gotten the best of him. The voices in his mind refused to be silent. So when he took his life, I was crushed, but I worked through that grief. C.S. Lewis wrote a classic book, A Grief Observed, and I think it's a perfect title because for the past 4.5 years, that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been observing grief. My sister Mary went into hospital on Halloween in 2010 with what we thought was the flu. And after spending a month in ICU on a respirator, she died in the first Sunday of Advent. That month she spent in the hospital was a roller coaster ride. Just when it appeared the doctors were making some progress in treating her illness, another setback occurred. During those 4 weeks, we hung on every word, every possible statement, positive statement from a nurse or a doctor. We needed to believe that Mary would be okay. She was only 47. She would get better, and that glorious smile that brought so much joy to those who were caught in its radiance would once again shine with light and laughter and love. But in the end, modern medicine could not stop the spread of death that was advancing in my sister's body. No army of antibiotics could stop that advance. No antiviral drugs or dialysis offered hope for her. Oh, maybe for a while, but in the end it provided no defense. So one by one her vital organs failed, and if Mary had not had such a strong heart, it's doubtful she would have even survived that month she spent in ICU. It was a roller coaster of emotions that captured that month that Mary spent in ICU that also captures for me grief. And the grief I've come to know these last few years. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously gave the world what we now come to know as the 5 stages of grief. Those stages were based on experiences of patients suffering terminal illness. We're familiar with the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Those stages have been adapted to all sorts of changes that we experience in life. Anything that we name and claim as loss, the loss of a job, or the moving from one place that held so many memories for us to a new location, or the death of a relationship or a divorce, the betrayal of a friendship, the death of a loved one. We go through those 5 stages of grief. But unfortunately, what often happens to those who are grieving, those who are familiar with those 5 stages, is the misconception that every person moves through those 5 stages to a place where they find acceptance. So some people feel that after a certain length of time, after all, doesn't time heal all wounds, as the old cliche goes, that they should somehow find some closure to the grief that they've experienced after a traumatic loss or the tragic death that has left a scar upon their hearts. I'm sorry I don't buy those who peddle the notion that time heals the wound. Because even though the wound of loss may heal and does heal over time, the scar survives. And when we touch the scar after months or years, we may feel the loss as intensely as when we did when we first heard the news. And the grief lingers. Those who suggest that we get over unacceptable losses either haven't experienced the loss of a loved one, or they've allowed their grief to harden like quick-setting cement that will cover the hole left in their heart, but will never seal or disguise where the hole is. In her last book in 2004, the last book she wrote before she died, Dr. Kubler-Ross lamented how her 5 stages of grief became a template for those who grieve a loss in their lives. She said these 5 stages were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to losses that many people have, but there's not a typical response to loss because there is no typical loss. Each of our losses are personal. Each of our losses are real. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. The Tour de France has stages, but grief is not a bicycle race. It's more of a roller coaster ride that has ups and downs. We don't complete one stage and then move to the next until we arrive at the finish line at a place called acceptance. There's no timetable for grief, no ribbon at the finish line for those who grieve. So a more hopeful analogy for me, in which I find hope and healing in dealing with my own grief, has come from Dr. Patrick O'Malley, who's a psychotherapist in Fort Worth, Texas. He wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times several months ago, and it was called Getting Grief Right. In his practice, people who were stuck in one of the stages of grief were often referred to him. And in the article, he focused especially on a woman named Mary who came to see him 6 months after losing her daughter to sudden infant death syndrome. 10 years before, Dr. O'Malley had lost his firstborn child before he was a year old. His unacceptable and tragic loss had influenced and informed the way Dr. O'Malley helped patients deal with their grief. And as Dr. O'Malley tells his patients, there is no right way to grieve. Mary came to see him because she was well versed in those 5 stages of grief. She thought her grief would be temporary, that she would be able to put the death of her daughter behind her and get on with her life. Dr. O'Malley reminded Mary of the enormous loss that she had experienced and told her the depth of her sadness is simply of a measure of her deep love for her daughter. In talking about grief, O'Malley prefers chapters instead of stages. The first chapter, he says, is attachment, the strength of the bond with the person who has been lost. This explains, for example, the grief over my sister's death 4.5 years ago that continues and is more intense than my grief over the death of my father just last December. Though he was my father and I loved him deeply, Dad and I were never as close as fathers and sons, and even as most fathers and sons, I suppose. And even though Mary was entering into first grade when I left to join the high school seminary as a freshman in high school, and so I missed those years of her growing up, except those summers when I was home, and Mary being the youngest, I could spoil her like everyone else. We became close over the years as adults, and I long admired her energy and her spirit and her compassion, especially for those who were on the margins, those who were down in their luck. Dad was 93 when he died on December 7th. And I'll never forget standing with him at the casket of my sister, Mary, and Dad telling me, I remember bringing her home in my arms from the hospital a few days after she was born, and then looking at me saying, what am I doing standing here? And she's in there. According to Dr. O'Malley, that captures the second chapter of grief, what he calls the death event itself. This is often the moment when the person experiencing the loss begins to question one's sanity, particularly when the death is premature and traumatic. This helps name for me why Mary's death and the grief that follows still lingers. She was only 47, seemingly had so much life ahead of her when she died. And Dad was 93 and had been praying to die at least since he buried his youngest daughter. The third chapter of grief, Dr. O'Malley wrote, is that long road that begins after the last casserole dish is picked up and the outside world stops grieving with you. This is the difference between mourning and grieving that I mentioned earlier. Many want closure to grief. But my friends, the grief, the hard work of grief continues. Like the chapters of our lives, grief is an open book. Or as the writer Isaac Denison put it, all sorrows can be borne if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. So instead of thinking of grief in terms of stages, perhaps think of grief in terms of chapters, in that never-ending story of our lives. Because, as Dr. O'Malley says, when a loss is a story, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. There is no pressure to move on. There is no shame in intensity or duration. Sadness, regret, confusion, yearning, all experience of grief become part of the narrative of love for the one who has died. If we didn't love so much, we wouldn't hurt so much. My friends, this is the work of God that Jesus reminds us tonight. The work of God is to believe in the one God sent. And as we believe that God is love, then the work of God is the work of love that allows us to trust in the God who is present to us in darkness and sadness of grief, whispering reminders that if we did not love so much, it wouldn't hurt so much. I have come to believe that the length of grief is in proportion to the depth of our love. And since our love for those who have died never ends, there's really no timetable to grief. And because God's love is intimate and infinite, so our love for those who have died transcends time. Love measures grief. And the love of Jesus carries us through those dark and difficult times, no matter how long they might last. I am the bread of life, Jesus says to us tonight. And as our tears are mingled in the bread and wine, in the body and blood of Christ tonight, come to know and trust the truth of what Jesus says. Whoever comes to me will never hunger. Whoever believes in me will never thirst. Come then, my grieving friends, to the table of Eucharist, to taste and see the presence of God, the presence of love in our lives. Here in the communion of saints, all our loved ones who've gone before us in faith, whose memories crowd our hearts and minds, whose spirits join us around the table, whose stories are woven into the narratives of our lives, they remind us that we know the last chapter of our lives by heart, and it is written upon our heart by the very hand of God. It is the book of life that we already know the ending. I am the resurrection and the life, says the Lord. Whoever believes in me will never die and shall live forever.